That might be a mic. Good morning, everyone. This is John with Gun.Deals. Today, we are going to be settling the age-old question of piston versus DI, and we're going to be answering that with a solid, it depends. But before we get into that, go ahead and like, share, and subscribe, as that is all free and helps us out quite a bit. And go ahead and comment your favorite in the comments down below, and go ahead and pick a fight with somebody for fun. Now, before we get into this discussion and some of my opinions, I do want to set some parameters and give you guys some description. So first off, we're not really going to be talking about the AKs as they're kind of their own separate discussion. We're mostly going to be AR-like in terms of piston versus DI. Now, what do our terms mean? There are a couple different types of piston rifles. In general, you have long stroke, which is a large continuous piece of reciprocating mass. And then you have a short stroke piston, which usually has a separate op rod and bolt carrier. The op rod smacks the bolt carrier, gets it to start its cycle. They're both an external piston system, but they operate slightly differently. The direct impingement or internal piston, if you want to be very pedantic about how the system actually works, has a tube of gas generally that flows into the carrier that actuates, again, that internal piston, or direct impingement, again, however you want to quantify that, and then gets the action to start its cycle. Starting out our discussion, let's get into the most important facet, and that is going to be reliability. Now, if you were around a couple decades ago, there was a huge push towards piston rifles for everything. For whatever reason, the consensus was that piston rifles were more reliable than DI. If you had a DI rifle, you were literally going to get killed into streets, as the kids say, but nowadays, or even back then, that probably wasn't really the case. Both have strengths and weaknesses. There are certain areas where a DI gun is going to perform better. Like if you watch a lot of different mud tests or ice tests, there are certain tests where a DI AR will do better, and there are certain circumstances you can manufacture where a piston AR will do better. Now, the reason why it's very hard to say that, oh, DI is better or piston is better is because there's so many different types of piston rifles and so many different brands and ways you can do a DI AR-15 that it becomes very difficult to actually quantify in a meaningful way that, oh, well, piston rifle better than DI rifle, when there are so many variables to control. The really nice thing about the modern market anyways is that most of the options out there are going to work very well. If you're not scraping the bottom of barrel, not just in terms of price, but in terms of quality design, like there are some companies out there charging more money for a subpar design, in my opinion. But if you're getting a good example of a DI or a piston AR, you're probably not going to run into too many issues. So we're kind of in a good place as far as that goes. So reliability, kind of a wash, though of course you can always set up an example where a piston or a DI AR is going to do better. That kind of ties into durability. Both, again, have different weaknesses in this area. For instance, on a DI AR, you usually have gas rings on the inside. Those burn out every 2,000 to 5,000 rounds, and then they need to be replaced, or else you might not have a efficient enough gas seal to get the gun to actually run. Whereas on a piston rifle, sometimes you have a more complex operating system that has, I suppose, not necessarily a higher chance of going wrong, but you have more things that can go wrong. Bent op rods, more aggressive parts wear, because it is, usually speaking, a slightly more aggressive cycle than a DI AR-15. But again, in terms of durability, if we're talking a quality DI versus a quality piston, they're pretty darn close, though I will say that the DI AR, especially at the mid to high tier, is so figured out that they can run for an extremely long time with very minimal parts exchanges. And here is where we start to get a little bit of separation, and that's going to be the shootability. In general, DI ARs are going to be the cream of the crop in terms of recoil impulse, and if you watch competitive shooting at all, it's rare to see certain piston rifles, though you still might see them occasionally, but by and large, all of the best shooters are running DI ARs. They have the most desirable recoil impulse. If we want to get into why that is, well, they have low reciprocating mass because, by definition, a short stroke piston or a long stroke piston has to have more reciprocating mass because you actually have a solid op rod, whether it's attached to the bolt or not, reciprocating. And so usually that cycle is a little bit faster, it's a little bit more aggressive, and you have more reciprocating mass. So even on the best piston systems, they're very close and very good, and I would be comfortable. In fact, I have ran piston rifles in competitions before, but like for like, if I was tuning out a real race gun, it would be a standard DI AR-15. Now, if we flip that script a little bit, if we talk about suppressed shooting specifically, that is where the common wisdom, the general understanding is that piston guns run better suppressed than DI guns. And again, that is kind of true, but that's not the entire picture. So while I will say it is a slight win for piston shooting, it's not quite that simple. So the reason why piston rifles are in general better for suppressed shooting, especially with standard high flow cans, is that they do not have a gas tube pointed directly at the shooter's face that shoots a high pressure jet of hot cancerous gases back at the shooter's face directly. Now, that is part of the story, and that is eliminated with a piston rifle because, of course, all of that gets trapped up in the piston and it gets either vented out in the tube or out forward. They have different various ways to do that depending on what piston rifle you go with, but in general, you do get less gas back to the shooter. Now, what piston does not eliminate is gas back down the bore. So you still get gas coming back out the shooter, and depending on how the piston is set up, barrel length, suppressor type, you can still get gassed out on piston rifles because of gas coming down the bore, because you're only eliminating 30 to 40% of the total gas coming back. So again, depending on your specific piston rifle, you can make it shoot very bad suppressed, and if you put it up against a DI AR-15 that's specifically tuned with all the cool fancy parts to mitigate suppressed shooting with the DI, you can make it better. Again, I will still say it is generally easier to tune a piston rifle, and most piston rifles come with multiple different ways to tune them to mitigate gas to the shooter's face. So in general, I'll say that piston rifles are a little bit better than DI, and I think that is widely accepted. Now, another fairly objective win for DI rifles is going to be weight. By and large, there's no way around it. Instead of having a metal op rod slamming back and forth, you have a hollow steel tube with a very small low-profile gas block. It's very simple. In general, DI guns are always going to be a little bit lighter. Now, if you take like the most extreme end of the spectrum, like a PSA Jackal, which is like 1.5 pounds heavier than a standard AR-15 of a similar length, you have a big op rod, you have more reciprocating mass, you have a really big chunky gas block, which means you need a much taller upper receiver, which means you need a much thicker handguard, so it adds on a lot of weight to the total system. Now, that is of course a very heavy example and kind of the extreme case scenario. However, if you want something that is much more like an AR-15, like just an Adams Arms, rest in peace, or a Superlative Arms piston kit, those are pretty darn close in terms of weight, 3 to 4 ounces. So again, very, very negligible. Still a win for DI, but very negligible. And something like a Brownell's BRN 180 or a BRN 4, they're very close in terms of weight, but you're still sacrificing maybe a ½ pound in total. Is that a big deal for you personally? Not sure, but again, it is just kind of objective that in general, like for like, DI guns are going to be a little bit lighter than piston guns, and in some cases, a lot lighter. I will touch on this briefly, but people like to talk about accuracy of DI guns versus piston guns, and there are so many variables between the specific barrel manufacturers, the specific setups, the upper receivers, that day ammo types, all that sort of stuff, that it's kind of nebulous to the point of not really being worth talking about. I've shot piston rifles that are extremely accurate, and I've shot DI guns that are extremely accurate. So in terms of accuracy, somebody might think that mechanically there is a slight advantage with a DI gun, but in reality, with all these other variables at play, it is so item specific and individual build specific that it's pretty much worthless to compare DI to piston in this way, so I'm going to just call that a straight up wash. Now, the last factor that we're going to talk about, and again, this is going to be broad generalities here, but it's going to be cost. And this is why the piston rifle loses almost every single time when we talk about value, price to performance, or what you should get. Because of course there's always people asking, what about this, what about that? And the truth of the matter is that DI guns are in general much cheaper than their piston counterparts. The piston guns are a little bit more unique. There's lots of special things, and each company kind of has their own special way to get that done. So for instance, let's say a BCM AR at about $1,200 does everything that a $4,000 HK MR556A4 does for 1/4 of the cost or so, right? And I would even argue that it probably does it better than the MR556A4 in a lot of ways, right? Now, there are, of course, closer examples in terms of price. PWS, you know, $1,500 to $2K for a complete rifle, still on the more expensive side of things. BRN 180s are a little bit cheaper. PSA Jackal's about $1,300, but again, I would argue that a comparable quality AR is much cheaper than a comparable quality piston AR. and that's before we talk about some of the other downsides of piston rifle. Now, is that to say that piston rifles are bad and I don't like them? No, it's not true. It's just that they kind of lose out in a couple ways. Now, if you have a specific use case and a very specific example of why you went with the piston rifle, that's totally chill. Right here, we actually have the Ruger SR556, which is a very heavy, outdated piston AR, but I quite like it, even though it's certainly not perfect, but I do like it quite a bit. For somebody like me who doesn't care about brand loyalty or cool factor, most of the time I'm really just interested in how they actually shoot, how they actually perform, and of course, how much do I have to spend to get that performance. For me, it's always going to be a DI, although sometimes pistons are fun to mess around with. But that's my take on the matter. Go ahead and let me know what you think about all this in the comments down below. You can go ahead and fight with me about how wrong I am, and I am certainly not just engagement farming. But with all that out of the way, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I will see you in the next one. Peace off.